Hey there, everybody. Hey, Hart. Everybody, thanks for joining in tonight. We have got a special edition of the Urban Bourbon Hour, episode 16, with Sean Josephs from Pinhook Bourbon. And he's here already, and bring him right on in. What's up, everybody? Thanks for joining. Here's Sean now, connecting.
Hey there, how are you?
Hey, Sean, how's it going?
Doing great. Looking good.
How are you?
Really good. How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for joining me here tonight.
Oh yeah, my pleasure.
I've been very excited about talking to you and learning more about you and Pinhook. And I know a lot of people this week have been excited too. I've received all kinds of messages um, about this. So there's a lot of excited people to come on and hear from you tonight. So
Awesome.
it ought to be fun. Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So I'm just going to introduce you real quick for everyone that's kind of hopping on here.
Sure.
So everyone that's joining, again, thank you for coming on. This is Sean Josephs. He is the co-founder, master taster, and I'm also going to call you the master ambassador of
I guess, yeah.
Pinhook as well, because
I'll take that.
yeah, because you're out and about quite a bit, kind of familiarizing everyone with the brand.
Yeah.
So you can find him. Obviously, you can see his handle is #bourbon here on Instagram. So Sean, tell us a little bit. I know that you've told your story quite a bit. I've
Sure.
actually heard you on a number of podcasts
Yep.
and things. But if you can kind of just fill us in kind of a little bit on your background. I know that you have a background as a sommelier and kind of how that led you into bourbon and basically starting a whiskey brand.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say one thing I think is interesting is, especially when I assume like most of this audience is bourbon enthusiasts, is I think one thing that kind of separates us from a lot of other brands is that I would say I was very much like everyone else who's watching, right? I'm an enthusiast.
Yeah.
And so I came at it from the perspective of, being a bar owner that was focused around American whiskey, but doing that before the bourbon boom had begun, right?
Right.
So I had this interesting perspective of loving bourbon, again, like everyone else here, not having an experience working at a distillery, being trained, on the sensory team of a distillery, but just being someone who had a passion for bourbon. And, and then of course, the wine piece is a whole nother story, but essentially, I worked in restaurants. I worked my way up restaurants from being a food runner and ultimately to being a sommelier, which inspired me to open my own restaurant. And because I loved bourbon, and honestly had gotten, and I still love wine, but and I think what's fascinating now, if you consider the market now compared to where it was when I opened my bourbon bar, Char Number 4 in 2008, is that bourbon was incredibly accessible then, right? Because even the idea of Pappy Van Winkle being a thing had not yet happened.
Right.
Elijah Craig 18 was a $35 wholesale item, right? So bourbon was something easy and accessible. There really were no expensive bourbons. And it was kind of this idea. I worked in these very fancy restaurants where I was lucky to taste wine that no one is ever going to taste, to be honest. Like you either have to be incredibly wealthy or work as a server in a restaurant, right? Those are oddly the two ways that you could ever try it. And so I was kind of amazed. So one thing you learn when you study wine is we would do all these blind tasting groups, and I'm a certified sommelier from the Court of Master Sommeliers. I have my sommelier certificate from the American Sommelier Association as well, but lots of deductive tastings, lots of blind tastings, all this kind of stuff, all this palate training. And one of the things you're trying to learn isn't just, can I guess what grape is which? It's also, can I judge the quality level? Oh. And so when you're being trained to be a sommelier as a buyer, what you're really looking for is trying to judge quality relative to price, or like performance to price, right? That's really the key. And so I was kind of amazed doing all my palate training, wine training, whatever you want to call it. And then you taste these bourbons, which again, especially back then. So imagine Elijah Craig 18 and you bought it for $48. And you think about what a complex whiskey that is, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there were no expensive whiskeys. Vintage 17-year bourbon was $38 wholesale. Vintage 21 and 23-year-old rye, I think, were like 45 or 50. Like everything was inexpensive, and there were all these amazing things. So, long story short, I was pretty blown away, and there were plenty of wine bars, and I thought it would be really cool to open the wine bar equivalent of a bourbon bar, right? Where you were trying to serve really fantastic food that, in our case, kind of the smoked, grilled, and charred flavors that went well with bourbon, and giving people the opportunity to taste either a 1 ounce taste or a 2 ounce glass of basically what at the time was an encyclopedic selection of all of the American whiskey that was available, which was easy to do because all of it was easy to come by.
Yeah, I mean, I've read about Char Number 4, and I've seen it called like basically one of the most important whiskey bars, basically in that kind of led into this boom of bourbon. Like you were in New York, and I think there was probably some places in Kentucky that were kind of organized around their food with the whiskey, but doing it in New York was kind of like the first place outside of Kentucky that someone like approached whiskey in that way.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate, and I think our timing, you could either say, was really good or really bad. So Char Number 4 opened, I think, the same week that Lehman Brothers collapsed.
Oh.
So speaking of also being a difficult, financial circumstances, that was the beginning of the Great Recession. But it was a very affordable restaurant, both in terms of food, but also I thought it would be interesting to do a straight markup on all the products. So normally what you would see is the restaurant will say, well, there's a baseline. We can't charge less than X for a drink. But I thought it would be really fun to just do a straight markup with no variation, which meant that Kentucky Gentleman was $1. But also at the time, it meant that Elijah Craig 12 year was $4 an ounce. And wow. Elijah Craig 18 was $8 an ounce. And so you could really explore the entire universe of American whiskey. And so I think, because of the timing and with the recession, you could go in there, eat a chopped pork sandwich for $14, try 5 different bourbons and spend $13 trying 5 different bourbons. Drink a cold beer and feel like you had a good night of it without spending too much money.
Yeah, you're out of there for like $30 and you had a wonderful evening. Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So at the time, so you're coming at this, like you said, as an enthusiast, like all of us, like myself, like everyone that's watching here tonight.
Yeah.
So like at the time, was there like a particular, were you like a Wild Turkey guy, or were you like a Jim Beam guy, or was there like a distillery that you kind of admired and that like was kind of your brand that you went to at the time?
I mean, it's a great question, but I would also say no, because all of these things that we think of as allocated or limited items, from Elmer T. Lee to Elijah 18 to Vintage 23, and the list goes on and on and on, were all accessible, right? Yeah. So I was pretty amazed just by the entire array of what was out there. I mean, maybe I think Buffalo Trace, because I thought Rockville Farm was so good, and then Hancock's, which I think is really cool, which, is not really available anymore, was so good. But there's so much great stuff out there. But again, you have to remember too, people weren't really even very familiar with the idea of sourcing at the time, right? So there wasn't, even for me, I was kind of learning as I went, because it wasn't clear to people like, oh, there's this place called Kentucky Bourbon Distillers, and they get barrels from Heaven Hill, and they get barrels from, MGP, which was LDI at the time, and they bottle them under all these different labels. And then what's Black Maple Hill? What's, where's Bullet Bourbon being made, which was Four Roses at the time. And so it was, I was I went into it loving bourbon, but then I really got to kind of dig in and discover more about how it all worked.
Yeah. So you started the restaurant in 2008, and then was the next natural progression just like, hey, I think that maybe I should take a stab at looking into actually creating my own brand? Like,
I
is
think
that?
what, I think even the idea of creating our own brand wasn't the first thought. My first thought, and again, you have to remember, right? At this time, there's one maker's mark.
Right.
That's it, right? And that's
Yeah.
maker's mark claim to fame. We make one thing, we make it really well. There's one expression of Basil Hayden's. There's one Knob Creek. There's basically Woodford, and then the master, distiller select, whatever. But like, it's a very limited universe at the time.
Yeah.
Single barrel picks hadn't really become a thing, right? So the universe was much smaller. And I remember thinking that in order for bourbon to continue to be interesting, there had to be different ways of looking at it, or assembling it, or making it, or thinking about it,
Yeah.
because the rules are so strict. If you think about how it's made, we don't need to get in. I think everyone here knows a lot about bourbon, but we don't have to get into the laws of how you make bourbon. But it's a very narrow category, right? And so I think, to me, it's not that I didn't see interesting things, but if you think about there were almost no craft distilleries at the time.
Yeah.
Basically nothing, just a few guys. Stranahan's was around, Hudson Baby Bourbon was around, St. George was around, but really even Balcones hadn't been out yet. I think High West had just come on the scene, so there really wasn't much going on. And so I just felt like there was a lot of room for, I don't think innovation is even the right word, but I just thought, like, there's got to be different ways of, a different approach.
Yeah.
And so,
Well,
go ahead, sorry.
yeah, yeah, no, continue. So then like, how did you come to find, you eventually sourced from, it was at the time LDI, which everyone now
Yeah.
knows as MGP, Midwest
Yeah.
Green Products. Like, how did you find them? Like, how did you come to them and be like, okay, this is where we're going to source from?
So now that I think about it, I don't remember. First of all, it's funny to think that someone had to tell you about it, right? But nobody knew about it. Or
Right.
I shouldn't say nobody. People like me didn't know about it, right? I'm sure if you were in the industry and you worked at another distillery, obviously you've heard of LDI.
Yeah.
But for someone like me, coming at it from the essentially like consumer/buyer side, I wasn't familiar with the whole landscape. So I just started, I was pretty naive, started by like going to Heaven Hill, asking Drew Colsveen, because he would come into char number 4, like, hey man, are you any interest? And he's like, no, I'm not doing that anymore. Heaven Hill, like, I'm like, hey, Heaven Hill, I know you've got 1 million barrels lying around. I just want 20. And and so it really, interestingly, it took a lot of digging, weirdly, at least for me, to essentially, quote unquote, find them. But of course, once you find them, you pick up the phone and like, what do you want? What do you want? 200 barrels, 2,000 barrels, 20,000 barrels, like, so we paid $465 a barrel for 3-year-old bourbon.
Yes,
right?
I've heard you say this before. That's unbelievable.
So it's cool. I mean, in hindsight, what was so great about it is it's myself and, my 2 founding partners, Charles Fulford and Jay Peterson. So between the 3 of us, it was basically $9,000, to buy the barrels, plus another $240 a year in storage.
Yeah, which now would be like 10 times that, probably.
10 times that, and yeah. So, and that's really how we all kicked off. And we always say, like, my partners, who are also dear friends of mine, when we look back on it, we realized the biggest luxury we had was time, or at least the perception of time. So we weren't in a hurry. We weren't like, hey, there's an opportunity here, we need to build a brand. Yeah. We were more focused on, I think we can do something unique. We bought our 20 barrels, we shipped them. So the thing is, now you can go to MGP, right? Like, you can actually go to the facility.
Yeah, right, yeah.
That's a recent development. So at the time, you could not go. So you could continue to age your barrels there. But what we wanted, of course, was to taste through all of our 20 barrels and understand how different they were from each other, and to continue tasting them as they aged, and to like really think about, you know, what, you know, and I really thought about, it's like, what contribution can we make? Like, what can we do that, as someone that loves bourbon, what can we do that I think would be cool
Yeah.
and hasn't been done before, have a unique approach. And so we, you know, from when we bought the barrels to our first release in 2014, we spent 3 years going to Kentucky 4 or 5 times a year and just really visiting other distilleries, soaking it all in, you know, and just really taking our time to think about, you know, how to approach, you know, what we wanted to do.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned when you bought those barrels, they were like around 3 years old when you originally purchased the
Yep.
original 20 barrels.
Yep.
So you guys waited until what, 2014 was the
Yes.
first release? So
Yes,
was it
we had
released
6-year-old.
at like 7-ish years?
Well, we founded the company in 2010. We
Yeah.
didn't track down and purchase the barrels till 2011.
Okay.
So it was a 6-year-old, you know, the first bourbon was a 6-year-old bourbon.
And that was the Bourbon Courage, was that
Bourbon
that
Courage.
was the first
Yep.
release?
Bourbon Courage was the first one.
6-year-old. Yeah.
So, but I guess to back up 1 second, right? And you know, I guess you and I, or you've probably heard me talk about this before, but to me, it was the important thing. Coming from the wine side, right? The single thing that made the most sense to me as far as a different approach is that the entire bourbon industry was based, and mostly still is, on this idea that you have natural ingredients that are changing a lot because of all of these variables in nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether each barrel is different, the pores in the wood are different. I mean, the mineral content in water, the grain harvest, the barometric pressure during, you know, fermentation or during distillation. I mean, there's so many factors that are constantly making all the ingredients change. And so primarily the way the industry thinks about it is, how do I change all these constantly shifting variables to make each batch taste identical?
Right. Yes.
Which is the complete opposite of how you think about wine, right? So the whole idea of wine, of course, is you have these natural ingredients. Each year with those variables, with the vintage, how do you simply try to make the best expression of that vintage you can, irrespective of a flavor profile? So when I think about Pinhook, and kind of the original idea that we started with and have really stuck with, is this idea of, we're trying to make the best whiskey, not the same whiskey. There is no flavor profile. There is no preconceived notion of what our bourbon or rye tastes like. There is no set proof. There's simply the idea, it's like, okay, we're trying to shape this particular expression. These are the barrels we have. Let's taste through as many of them as they can, figure out which barrels we want to work with, and then bring them together in the way that leads to, and again, this brings me back to wine. I think about aromatic complexity, complexity on the palate, balance, length of finish, texture / mouthfeel, and alcohol integration, right? And those are the kind of guiding principles and parameters, right? And then that's what you're trying to achieve. And maybe one time that leads to this minty, eucalyptusy, herbal, fruity thing, and maybe some other time that leads to this spicy, earthy, dark fruit type of thing. It doesn't really matter as long as we hit those marks.
I love that, and I was actually going to ask you like what your philosophy was on that, which you just explained very well, that you're creating the best whiskey that you can at the time with what you have to work with. But let me ask you this from your point of view as the master taster, and essentially you're blending these batches. Like when you are doing that, obviously you have to like what you're tasting. Number one, I'm sure. I mean, you're not going to put anything in the bottle that you don't think tastes delicious.
Right.
But is there some element that you're thinking about while you're doing this? Like, do you have to think about like the general consumer that's out there as you're tasting, as you're kind of creating the blend, or is it purely just like, hey, this tastes the best to me, and that's what's going to go in the bottle? Is there any aspect of like thinking about your customer, basically, like a general customer that's going to come across Pinhook on the shelf?
It's a great question. I think it's just like food, right? Like different consumers, when they eat food, have different levels of understanding of food.
Mm-hmm.
And a chef might be off on this other land of thinking about like how much acidity versus how much fat versus how much spice, you know, all the different textures and how it all comes together. But the end result has to be delicious.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think on the one hand, I'm focused on all those parameters, but ultimately what I'm hoping is that my perception of what tastes good is just flat out delicious. Because I think that what I've found with food is you can put a bunch of people in a room with different levels of food expertise, but if someone puts out a really good dish, someone who's more, you know, more knowledgeable about food might be able to like dissect it and understand these different references and what a certain dish they're riffing off or whatever.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if it's delicious, everybody's going to think it's delicious, right?
True.
And I think with what I get with Pinhook, which I take as a compliment, and I don't mind, like, it's considered, I know for people who love bourbon to just be like, oh, it's smooth is a little bit of a kind of like a cop out. Like, it's not really descriptive, but to me, I take it as a compliment because you could replace it with the word balance.
Oh yeah.
Right? And the compliment I get a lot is that our stuff tastes smooth, or also that our higher proofed stuff. And even think about, you know, Rye'd, that's our kind of entry level everyday rye. It's 97 proof. So as you know, a lot of the everyday stuff is between 80 and 90 proof, not 97 proof. So when people taste our stuff at 97 proof, or I don't know if you got to taste the Bohemian bourbon yet at 114.5, and the feeling is kind of like, wow, the alcohol, there you go.
We're going to taste that.
And feel like the alcohol is integrated. Like, of course, you can tell that it's a big whiskey at that proof.
Yeah.
But you're getting, but the alcohol is being balanced by the other elements. And then people are like, wow, that doesn't really hit you as being as high proof as it is. So I take that. So for people who don't want to dig into these nuances, like, oh, it's a little bit floral and it's a little bit this and it's a little bit that. If they just say like, oh, that's super smooth for 114 proof, I'll take that.
Well, I will say that because I have the cask strength rye that you released towards the end of last year, right?
Yep.
And I have that here. That's 104. That's 114 proof.
Yep.
And then I have a single barrel of I think it's the Bourbon Country. It's yellow wax.
From Benny's.
Yeah, from Benny's.
Yeah.
And that one is like same proof range, and you cannot tell that they are that high of a proof whiskey because, like you said, they're dangerously drinkable is basically what I would say.
Yeah. And so I think hopefully that does answer your question, that is how I think about it, which is if I do my job right, even if I'm thinking about all of these different components and how to tie them together, the end result to someone else is just like, oh, that's really smooth, or that's really tasty. Or, then
that's great. So here's a good question, which we should probably touch on this a little bit so that people who aren't aware, like the connection of the name Pinhook and the horses. Can you kind of go over that for us and tell us how that all came to be?
Yeah. So one of my founding partners, who I mentioned, Jay Peterson, through his best friend from high school, who grew up in the horse business. Jay had some experiences in Kentucky and actually ended up getting married in Kentucky. So when we bought our barrels, he was the one who actually had the Kentucky connections, which gave us a place to stay at his friend Jamie's house. And so we already had this idea of the vintages, and we were just doing the other things one does in Kentucky, a lot of which is, like, as I said, visit distilleries. And then we were in Lexington, so going to Keeneland if we were there in October or April. And of course, we had an amazing time. And, you know, Jay had some experience. Charles and I hadn't really seen much of it. And for anyone who's never done it, I don't think you really have to know anything. If you enjoy having a fun day with your friends, you know, and you go to the track, you're going to have a pretty great time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Jamie does, which again, I knew nothing about, Jay did, but I'd never heard of it before, is pinhooking, which is a huge part of thoroughbred horse racing, which is when you buy baby horses based on their lineage with the explicit intent of selling them for a profit, right? So it's like a flip, it's a buy to sell.
Yeah.
And so we started noticing and learning about horses from Jamie that there are all these, besides the obvious, which is that, you know, bourbon and Kentucky are the two things, or bourbon and horses are the two things for which Kentucky's most famous.
Yeah.
But there are these interesting parallels with the pinhooking. So we connected the idea that we were pinhooking bourbon.
Yeah, flipping the barrels, yeah.
That was also really important to us too, because I guess going back to the Char number 4 piece and going back to that time, there was so little transparency, right? And this is back when people were just flat out lying about where they were getting their stuff from, literally just pretending they had a distillery. I don't think we need to like call out its names. We all know who was doing what, but like, you know, and for me, I was just like, I don't care where it's from as long as it tastes good. So the idea that you wouldn't be transparent made no sense to me. And so it was really this idea of saying that we buy and sell. We don't own a distillery, never had an ambition to own a distillery. I was like the worst science student on the planet. Like I fall asleep listening to people talk about distillation and fermentation and all that kind of stuff. Like I really am like, you guys do that. I just want to see if I can assemble some really delicious whiskey. And then the other parallel, of course, is like the horse business is kind of fickle, you know, and we're like, you know, there's a little bit of luck involved and you don't know how are these barrels going to mature. So you think you have a good guess of where it's going to go. And so because we had this vintage model already, we started to see all these parallels with thoroughbred horse racing, and then thinking about a way from a story standpoint. And it was also very authentic because we came about it through our friendships.
Yeah.
We could use the horses as a way of helping tell the story and also of anchoring each vintage, right? So, I mean, I think many folks watching already know this, but each year we have a horse for all of our rye expressions, which is, you know, the best, you know, the horse in Jamie's stable that he thinks has the best chance. Yep, there's Rye'd on. That he thinks has the best chance of making it to the Kentucky Derby, and same with the bourbon. But the other thing too was, you know, we were noticing, I was fascinated by all the collecting that people were doing, but the only way to tell the vintages for the most part was if you could read serial numbers. So we also just thought there was the room, and I think there's something also, we're serious about trying to make delicious whiskey, but it seemed like there's a lot of room to be a little more playful, you know. And so to me, it's kind of fun, this idea of you could have 4 Pinhook ryes lined up with, you know, they could all be green wax and all be different vintages with different horses on them. And I think it just adds a little fun to the world of bourbon.
Yeah, it's super fun. I mean, look at these. I mean, you got the blue wax from last year on the rye humor.
Yep.
I mean, now this is the bourbon, and then the rye this year. I mean, it's really cool, and it really does make it stand out on the shelf for sure. Like as you're going by those.
And the other thing we learned too, which was a lot of the fun of, you know, kind of doing our research and learning about this world that we didn't know a ton about, was historically jockeys always wear these incredibly brightly colored silks, because before the Jumbotron, the only way to see your horse on the backstretch was because you could look through your binoculars and like, oh, I'm rooting for the green horse or the purple horse or whatever it was. And so obviously it's kind of an homage to those brightly colored silks. And which again too, you know, obviously Maker's Mark has their red wax, but generally speaking, the bourbon world is like black wax, you know, brown or off-white paper. Like everything is kind of like this dark, you know, sort of rustic approach.
Yeah.
So we also just thought there was a fun way to, like, we weren't even at the level, we weren't like thinking sophisticated enough in terms of like shelf position at retail, but just thinking broadly about being able to do something that tasted different, looked different, and just had a different approach.
Yeah, it's really, really cool, and it's kind of evolved over the years from those vintage releases. And I know you had said that people ask you a lot about those like first 7. Was it the first 7 releases that kind of came in that like squatter kind of wine bottle? Yeah.
So there are two things about that. One, that bottle shape was discontinued.
Okay.
So we just flat out had to pick a different bottle shape. And we were not in a position to, you know, spend $20,000 to, you know, have a mold made in China, right? So we're just buying, you know, the glass that's available to us.
Yeah.
The second thing, which I always think is fun because it shows you a little bit where our heads were at, is we did 7 releases. Each one was 6 months apart. They were 6 months older, so it was all the same lot of barrels, and each release was about 15 barrels. So it went from 6 to 6.5 to 7 to 7, right, and so on and so forth. Each release was a different wax color, right? The labels were letterpressed.
Yes.
Which meant that they couldn't go through a roller on a machine, which is fine when you're only doing 15 barrels. Not that our production is so huge now, but like once you scale up, you know, you can't hand label, you know, every bottle at that point. And of course, we also realized, like, you know, and again, I'd like to think we're relatively smart, but we hadn't like gamed the whole thing out. It's like, how many colors are there? And how confusing is this going to get? So ultimately where we landed is we ended up picking colors for categories or expressions, right? So our straight rye is green. Our straight bourbon is orange. Our, we want to call this magenta, I guess. Our high proof bourbon is magenta. Our high proof rye is teal. Our single barrel bourbon is yellow. Our single barrel rye is this kind of like baby blue. So those colors always remain the same now year after year, with of course the vintage and the horse changing. So that's kind of how we made that transition from, you know, a bottle that's no longer available, and also frankly a model that like wouldn't have really worked as we started to add, because all of those were really just one expression.
Yeah, just getting older as it went.
The other thing I want to mention about that, though, because it's actually to me really important in where we ended up, and it says something I think about how I was thinking about bourbon. The first release we did, Bourbon Courage, was I tasted it at a bunch of different proofs, and then I proofed it at 90 because I thought that was the most balanced proof.
Yeah.
Because of everything I'd seen in the world of bourbon, I thought that we had now picked our proof.
So all the releases after that stayed at the 90
We're all
proof?
at 90, right? So what ended up happening, though, is as I started to go back, and again, this is, you know, as much as I was around it all the time, I definitely had a lot to learn. So in my head, I'm kind of like, well, it's just going to keep getting better, right?
Yeah.
It's just going to get older, and by the time it's 9 years, it'll be better than when it was 8 and 7 and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, what I discovered when I started going back to taste through them, oh, this one tastes really woody in the finish. Even though this one's 90 proof, this one seems really hot, you know? And so I realized that you had to look at each kind of group as its own thing. And I started to notice how much playing around with the proof was critical in getting the best expression. And so that's why now, in addition to not only blending to just, like I said, the best that we can make the barrels taste, I'll then taste each expression, except obviously single barrels, which we do at cask strength, at 10 to 15 different proofs, until I find what we call like the true proof, the proof that is the best expression for that particular blend. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about like the releases up until, let's not talk about the two most recent releases yet, but up until those two releases that have just come out, like what were the batch sizes that you were pulling out of your MGP inventory? Was it the same size batch each time?
You're saying
was it like a 65 barrel batch? Was it a?
So we did bourbon and rye was 150 total. I mean, Castle and Key, where we did that blending, 75 is about the max.
Okay.
That they can do. So we would break them up into 275 barrel. So we're in that kind of range. You're talking about 150 barrels would be kind of like an average. The high proof rye, that was a blend of 65 barrels was the total production on that.
All right. So when you're doing those particular blends of like that, that's a good amount of barrels to be like figuring out how to put them together into a blend. And I'm sure you're choosing from, you know, so many more barrels beyond that.
Correct.
How do you get it down to those like 65-ish that you feel are like right for that particular batch? I mean, that seems pretty sizable job to like get it to that point.
It's a great question, and I think it's a really important question too, because it speaks to this idea of, and it's not my favorite word, but I don't know a better word, like the idea of craft. But I think of it more as like craftsmanship, like how do you shape something?
Yeah.
And so what are we getting when we buy certain things versus other things? Not better or worse, but, you know, what does it take to do, you know, the approach that we have? So using the high proof bourbon, I'll use that one as an example because I know a lot of people like it. Or sorry, the high proof rye. That, the teal wax rye humor. That started as 120 barrels. We tasted every single barrel. From the 120 barrels, we eliminated 30. So let's say that those 30 barrels, it's not that they were all bad, but we were picking the 90 barrels that we thought would be the most interesting to work with.
Yeah.
From those remaining 90 barrels, we created 5 different 65 barrel blends.
Oh, wow.
Right? So imagine, obviously, that there's a decent amount of overlap from all 5 versions, but also none of them are, of course, identical. And then from those 5, pick the one that I thought was, you know, so it's, you know, I don't know, call it 80 hours, you know, of combination of tasting. And what you're doing is once you do the initial tasting, you put the barrels into what we call pods. So you maybe put on average 10 barrels together. So that way, if you're blending different 10, sometimes 5 barrel groups together, you might, first you kind of know the characteristics. You start by knowing the characteristics of all the barrels.
Yeah.
Then you taste them as a pod. Then
So
you know the characteristics.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but when you say pod, is that pod based on like a certain flavor or like
No, it's really just, I mean, it's done with some thoughtfulness, but generally it's like, okay, we tasted through all the barrels. Let's see what these 10 are like together. Let's see what these 10 are like together. So you're literally taking equal amounts, you know, from all of the, you know, single barrel samples to create a blend of those barrels. So from there, you then taste all the pods. So now you know the pod characteristics. And then you're playing around with matching up different pods together. And if you have pods that can be problematic, then you can kind of go back to your tasting notes and say, oh, well, you know, this one had a couple of really hot barrels in it. Let's see what happens. I love this other pod. This other pod's incredible, but it could probably sacrifice 2 of these barrels that were showing like really sweet and showing a lot of fruit, and do a little flip flop and try to see if you can get the pods to even out, and just keep playing around until hopefully you get something really special.
Yeah, that's really cool insight into how it works. So thanks for kind of clarifying that and explaining kind of how it works. I mean, I nerd out over that stuff. Like, I think it's really cool to kind of hear the process that goes into like getting it to, you know, to what's inside the bottle. It's really, really cool. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship with Castle and Key, like how that came to be, and then eventually getting into a relationship with them that they are now distilling your proprietary mash bills that you kind of came up with. Like how did that happen to get hooked up with them?
Yeah, so that was just more good fortune. So, you know, friends of Jamie, and actually a gentleman we'd also met his wife because she was our liquor attorney in Kentucky, this guy, Will Arvin. He was the guy that got the wild hair. And, you know, I think for a lot of people who've seen either Castle and Key, you know, over the years as it was being restored, or have seen it since it was restored, it's a pretty majestical place.
Yeah.
And it's easy to think, well, why didn't I think of that? But it was sitting there rotting, you know, for almost 50 years, and it was for sale for $850,000. So, you know, it's 113 acres. Obviously water being the most important ingredient in bourbon, the spring, which was the reason why Colonel Taylor picked the site. And he built this beautiful key-shaped well around it because he said the water was the key to his bourbon. That's still intact. Warehouses B and E still intact. The castle he built still intact. So while there are a lot of buildings that were collapsed and ruined, there was, you know, a lot of usable infrastructure as well. But that said, you know, no one was interested. And Will had a passion for bourbon and was excited about the idea of restoring, you know, this historical property. And we were just lucky that we were friends with him. And, you know, at the time, you know, Pinhook, we were really just distributed in New York, Kentucky, and a little bit in Louisiana because that's where I live now. And we were the first people they approached. They knew they needed to do contract distilling in order to have a workable model. They asked us if we would work with them. And this again, you have to understand this, they had no idea who was going to be distilling. Like, they hadn't hired anybody. They were just doing asbestos abatement, right? This was really a vision and passion, and we figured that they would figure it out. And obviously we were rewarded, you know, pretty amazingly.
So when you first started that relationship and you got to the point where you were going to start picking out what was going to be your mash bills.
Yep.
That was when Marianne Barnes, now Marianne Eaves, she was the master distiller there at that time when you started to plan the mash bills, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So you worked with her to kind of come up with those mash bills. Did you kind of have something in mind that you were thinking that you wanted the recipes to be for each, or did you kind of just go into it and say, let's see what tastes good when we put it together?
Definitely. The short answer is the latter.
Okay.
Yeah. I really, you know, I think that I think the one thing that was good about all my time in restaurants and working with great chefs and all the time I spent around wine is, and I don't mean this, not in this way where you're just like, I have the best palate, but you have to learn how to trust your palate. Right. And you have to, at this point, you've tasted enough stuff and you've done the blind tastings and you've gone through it all. And so it's not about thinking that your palate's better than anyone else's, but it's also about trusting your own palate. And so I guess even if it sounds oversimplified, I just felt confident that, you know, give me a chance to taste a bunch of mash bills and I'll pick whatever, you know, going back to what I said before, I'm looking for complexity. I'm looking for balance. I'm looking for structure. I'm looking for length of finish. And I will say, on the one hand, while I had tasted plenty of White Dog before, I'd certainly never tasted White Dog with an eye towards what is it going to be? Like, what will this become?
Yeah.
And so I actually remember, and to your point, which is, it is a great question, sitting there with Marianne and saying, okay, these are the ones I think taste the best, right? But am I missing something? Meaning, maybe it's the ones that don't taste the best as White Dog that will somehow manifest in these other ways that I'm not understanding because this isn't, you know, this isn't what I've done. I haven't done this before. And her answer simply was like, whatever one you like the best, it's only going to get better, obviously, as it spends time in a barrel. So you should just go with the ones that that you think are the best. And we did end up, it was interesting, picking a very unusual rye mash bill.
And let's talk about that. That's this guy here. So this is the Rye'd. This is the first ever rye to come out of Castle and Key with your proprietary mash bill, of course. So I was saying to you over direct message, this is a pretty historic whiskey, if you ask me, being a bourbon enthusiast.
I mean, I'd like to think so, and not in a way. I mean, in a way, we just stumbled into it. But to me, it's kind of fun that we just started by obviously buying barrels from this very big distillery that it turns out, you know, everyone but me knew about, and then to end up being able to, you know, kind of stumble into being a little piece of history is pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interestingly, you know, if you travel around the country, because a lot of people haven't necessarily heard of Castle and Key yet because it's only been open so long. But if you say Old Taylor, obviously everybody knows that immediately.
Oh yeah.
So it's and when I picked the mash bill, I didn't know not Four Roses. Old Forester rye had not come out yet, so I wasn't familiar with there being these higher barley ryes out there. So this is 60% rye, 20% barley, 20% corn.
Super interesting mash bill for sure.
And you haven't tasted this before, right?
No, I just popped the bottle that you sent, which thank you very much for sending this. And let's give this guy a taste.
Yeah,
This is
I'm gonna have to splash myself.
this is the first. You know, I like to call this my friend Mike. You know, Mikey, the Bourbon and Rye Club.
Yep.
Likes to call this bottle to throttle. You pop the top and goes right into the glass. So very. You know what? Now, people make fun of me when I try and taste whiskey with the people with the guests I have on the show, but I like to. I like to give my notes. So if I'm a fool, please let me know.
No, I honestly love hearing other people's notes.
So right off the bat, this is very like minty for me on the nose.
Yeah, I think it's super minty.
And a little bit of like a kind of like a baking spicy cinnamon kind of note in there. Ah, really, really fragrant. Nice little kind of golden color to this.
Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers, everybody out there. Ooh, that is tasty. Lots of cherries for me on the palate on this one. And kind of like a cloviness or like a...
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit up to me, you know, people will look at maybe the different components and have their own specific notes, but I think to me you hit them all, is that it has this kind of minty herbaceous component. It has this nice spice component, whether you want to call it clove or whatever it is, and it's got a fruit component.
Yeah, and this is, Sean, what is the age on this? It's
2.5 years is the average.
2.5 years, okay.
Yeah.
I would never know that from tasting this. I mean, and the finish on it is like, wow, it's like hanging around and just kind of sitting there on the back of my tongue, and very nice finish to this.
What I love too about what you said, and I think it's really important, is I also agree, and I hope other people feel the same way, that you don't taste it and say, oh, this tastes like a really young whiskey.
No.
Right? On the other hand, you couldn't make a whiskey taste like this with older whiskey. Yeah. And so to me, it speaks to something that I find really interesting, is I don't think younger whiskey is just whiskey that's, you know, something to taste and say, I can't wait till it's 2 years from now.
Yeah.
And it's also the way you were talking about, like thinking about it like wine. In the world of wine, there's room for that crisp, dry white. Right. And then there's also room for, you know, a wine that has oak age on it and is more full bodied. Like you need both. And I like a rye. Like to me, this is just an everyday drinking rye. Great for a cocktail. Would be great on a warmer day. It's more refreshing. And there's plenty of other great ryes out there that showcase different profiles. But I kind of like this, you know, I think it's the youthful aspects that give it that bright character.
Yeah, it's bright. It's got like a nice like punchiness to it. I mean, that I could see that for sure being like, I mean, if you're a bar or restaurant, man, that would be killer to have in a cocktail at your bar or restaurant, because that packs like really nice flavor and would cut through a lot of would hold up to a lot of the things that you would mix with it.
Well, and that's the other thing too, at 97 proof, it can take the dilution in a cocktail. And I do think too, I mean, you know, I'd be curious to get your perspective in like how it expresses itself. But to me, the barley has this kind of nutty, savory aspect. And I think it's what's helping kind of soften the edges of the rye. And it's what's rounding it out. It's kind of like smoothing and polishing the edges.
Yeah, I mean, it is so unique. There really is not, I really can't compare it to anything else in the rye category. Like it's really got a unique kind of flavor profile to it.
My hope is, if we can achieve, like, on the one hand, it doesn't, I love you saying it doesn't taste like anything else. If it can achieve that and then still just be also like at the same time, just be super tasty,
Oh yeah,
then to
it's
me,
that.
that's like mission accomplished, right?
Absolutely.
Is to take a different approach.
Well, can we talk about this one now? So
Yes. I'm excited for you to try this.
this is the next release that has come out of Castle and Key. Your proprietary mash bill.
Yep.
Um, Again, this is a historic whiskey. It's the first bourbon to be your distillate, your mash bill, and the
Yep.
first bourbon to be bottled coming out of Castle and Key. So
Yep.
again, two really historic bottles. I mean, and again, thank you for sending this. This is really, really cool.
I'm excited for you to try this one. This is interesting though, because I ended up picking, in some ways, this is about as traditional a mash bill as you're going to get. Or I think if you start looking at industry mash bills for bourbon, you'd see a lot that fall pretty close to it. So it's 75% corn, 15% rye, and 10% barley. But I kind of love the idea of, I feel like the world of rye had more room to play around in some ways. But I always felt, you're asking about what bourbons I like. I think I always fell for those, like someone would come into jar number 4 and they're like, give me a bourbon. Like, I want to taste, like, what does bourbon taste like? And I was like, how about some Rock Hill Farm?
Mm.
That kind of like butterscotch, cotton candy, fruity, great spice.
So this one on the nose is like very tropical
Yeah.
to me. Very, very tropical, like citrusy kind of. And there's also, I don't know, there's also a note, I can't put my finger on it. It's kind of like a buttery, kind of nutty,
Yeah.
like a bread almost.
You know what? I swear it's in my notes, and it's, I guess, more of like a wine or a champagne note, but I said brioche, which you think of as like buttery bread, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, like a croissant almost.
Yeah.
I get off of this.
Yeah.
But really tropical too, like a really tropical note to it.
So the average age of these barrels is just north of 34 months. So let's just say it's just shy of 3 years.
3 years, yeah. All right, I got to taste this. Cheers, Sean, and cheers everybody out there.
Sorry to many people. This is just starting to hit the shelves, I think, in the next week or two, around the country.
Wow. So again, that kind of translated to the palate a little bit, a kind of tropical note across the palate, but then I'm getting like a chocolatey kind of backing up that fruitiness, like a kind of like a chocolate type flavor coming in, and a little kind of nuttiness. Wow, that's really good. And again, the finish on it kind of just hangs around really nicely. Nice little heat to it too. So that is the Bohemian bourbon, and you're calling this the high proof.
We're calling it high proof.
High proof.
Yeah, so what a good opportunity to make just like a quick distinction. So last year we did cast strength.
Yeah.
And I think what I realized is because we're so focused on playing around with the proofs, so I wanted to give us a little bit of freedom basically at the high end. So, this was probably just around 116 at cast strength, and we bottled it at 114.5. And I wish, at some point it would be fun to have the opportunity to do this, but I tasted this at 10 different proofs, from, kind of from 105 up, and really finding for me, again, what was like the true proof, like what is this sweet spot at the higher end of the proof spectrum. Yeah. The other thing I want to mention too, at the risk of saying anything that would be like salesy, but it's important to me, like philosophically, this bottle, this is unfiltered, 114.5 proof. The SRP is $49.99.
That's crazy. That's such a good price.
It's been a big part for me, because when I got into it, I don't blame these big distilleries for seeing where the bourbon industry went. I mean, if anyone remembers Black Maple Hill, Black Maple Hill's 16-year bourbon was $132 wholesale when Elijah Craig 18 was $35 wholesale. And presumably they essentially via KBD had sourced their barrels from Heaven Hill. And so,
Yep.
you know, if you're Heaven Hill, you didn't really think that that market existed. So I can't really blame you when you discover the market to say, wow, I didn't know there was this like super premium category, you know, but by the same time, it was hard not to be a little bit bummed out to see these things that were accessible and affordable become unaffordable. And so within reason for what we can do as a smaller company, our goal was to make an affordable product and still put all the energy and effort into putting out the best product we can. And so if you look at our price range, at least in terms of what the SRP is, and of course it depends on the state and it depends on the retailer, but essentially it's $35 to $37 for like a ride on.
Yep.
You know, $49.99 for a high proof expression, and then $64.99 for cast strength single barrels. So
when you look at the market right now, that is, you're providing a great value at those prices for the product, the proof. Just like you kind of started off this whole conversation, how you said that in wine, you're always looking to the value that it would provide according to its quality.
Yeah.
And you've translated that into the whiskey and the philosophy for Pinhook, and it's really cool that you do that, because you could have very easily come out with a cask strength whiskey and you could have said $100, $100 easily. I mean, people are doing it all the time.
It's a whole, like, I'm sure, I know we're short on time, but like it opens up a whole nother conversation. But I'm also just fascinated by, you know, one of the things that the bourbon industry has done a horrible job of is quality relative to price. Meaning there's some things out there that are way too cheap for how good they are. And I know we all love that as bourbon lovers, right? But it's hard to have a narrative. Like the wine industry has done a very good job of, like, when you taste up the chain in a region like Burgundy, for example, you know, the higher up the chain you get, you're getting the better vineyard parcels. They're more careful with the fruit as they pick it. They use their better barrels. So everything, you know, becomes more fine-tuned. And I really hope in a way that if someone tastes our everyday flagship product, they should feel like when they go from 35 to 49, you should taste the difference.
Yeah.
Right? It should be a step up.
That is a very...
those steps should continue to be there. And that's why it's like, it's kind of messed up when it's like, oh, it's Henry McKenna was $29. And it's like, yeah, but $29 for 10-year-old single barrel just doesn't even make any sense.
No, it's,
you know, I mean, and it's like, we can all, and I'm saying that, and I'm, with all apologies to everyone who's listening, I don't mean like good for everyone who likes to buy it, but it sets up a weird narrative for the consumer when there's no connection. And then someone meanwhile can come along and say, well, I only produce this much and it's 3 years old, but I'm going to charge you $120 a bottle, whatever it is. Like it's, you know, and they're entitled to do that, but it's so all over the yard. Whereas I think there are other industries where it's more clearly established.
Yeah.
You know, kind of like what you get at different price points.
Yeah. Well, I definitely will say that, like, when you step up from the price points within Pinhook, I think you guys are definitely delivering that next level of quality and value, and still at a value. But Sean, yeah, we are running up against time here tonight. I mean, that hour flew by. But I really do want to thank you so much for your time, even
thank you.
all the time that it took, you know, to set up the meeting and talking back and forth, and for sending these wonderful and historic whiskeys. Thank you for that. And really a great conversation with you tonight. And I hope that as you guys continue to grow and these new releases come out, we can come back on here and kind of talk about those as well.
I'll come back anytime. It was great to meet you, and obviously I recognized a lot of the folks who jumped in and joined us, you know, via the magic of Instagram. So thank you to everybody who probably has heard some of this before but decided to listen anyway. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks again, Sean. And let's stay in touch. And hey, enjoy your Thursday night and your Friday and your weekend, and hopefully this all ends for us soon, but cheers to you.
Cheers, Chris. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Take care, Sean.
All right, take care. Bye, everybody.
Cheers. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining tonight. What a great conversation with Sean.